On June 22, 2026, at his home in Manhattan, one of the most powerful men the music business has ever produced took his final breath. He was 94 years old. He had been in and out of the hospital that spring for a respiratory illness, but even that couldn't quite convince anyone that Clive Davis was mortal. This was a man who had been signing hit records since Lyndon Johnson was president. A man who was still throwing the most exclusive party in the entertainment industry at 92. A man whose ears, according to the people who worked with him for decades, never lost their edge. His family confirmed the news publicly, and the tributes started pouring in almost immediately. From artists whose careers he built from nothing, from executives who spent their whole professional lives trying to be half as good at this as he was, and eventually, from a former president of the United States. But underneath the headlines about a fortune that may stretch past $800 million, there's a quieter story. A story about a man who lost both his parents before he'd even finished college, who talked his way from a Brooklyn walk-up into a full ride at Harvard Law, and who somehow ended up reshaping what an entire nation listens to on the radio. This is the story of Clive Davis, the money, the music, and the family he left behind who, by all accounts, loved him not for what he built, but for who he was to them. Clive J. Davis was born April 4, 1932, in the Crown Heights section of Brooklyn. His father, Herman, worked as an electrician and sold neckties on the side. Nothing about his upbringing suggested that this kid would eventually be dubbed the man with the golden ears, and would spend a career deciding which songs America would fall in love with. Then tragedy hit early. While Davis was still a freshman in college, he lost both of his parents within a short span of each other, a loss he would later attribute to complications from high blood pressure. Suddenly broke and without a support system, he moved in with his married sister just to finish school. Cite index equals 2-1. He had been attending New York University on scholarship, and he went on to graduate magna cum laude/Cite. From there, things accelerated fast. He earned a scholarship to Harvard Law School, graduated with honors in 1956, and took a job as a contracts lawyer in Midtown Manhattan, drafting agreements, handling tax matters, doing the unglamorous work that lawyers do. It was about as far from rock and roll as a career could get. But his firm represented CBS. And CBS owned a record label called Columbia Records. At 28 years old, on the recommendation of a former colleague who thought his contract background could be useful, Davis crossed over from law into music. He had no training as an A&R man. He had never worked a mixing board. What he had was an instinct nobody could quite explain, and it was about to change the entire trajectory of American pop culture. He rose through Columbia at a startling pace, assistant counsel, then general counsel, then an executive vice president role, and by 1967, at just 35, he was named president of the label. A lawyer from Brooklyn was now running one of the most important record companies on the planet. What made Davis different from every other suit sitting in a boardroom wasn't just business acumen. It was that he actually listened, closely, obsessively, to the music itself. Music critic Anthony DeCurtis, who co-wrote Davis's memoir, once described his approach to hearing new artists this way. He had a distinct sense of what would connect with an audience and what wouldn't, and he trusted that instinct completely. At Columbia, that instinct built one of the greatest artist rosters in music history. Janis Joplin, Santana, Bruce Springsteen, Billy Joel, Aerosmith, Earth, Wind and Fire, Pink Floyd, Sly and the Family Stone, Chicago, Neil Diamond. This wasn't a label roster, it was the backbone of classic rock radio for the next 50 years. Springsteen, who Davis signed to Columbia when the future boss was just 22 years old and a complete unknown, later described how Davis treated him with the same respect after he became one of the biggest names in music as he did back when he was, in Springsteen's words, a nobody. But 1973 brought a stunning fall. Davis was fired from Columbia amid allegations that he had misused company funds, including reports that some of it involved expenses tied to his son's bar mitzvah. Rolling Stone covered the ouster in detail that summer, framing it as part of a broader payola scandal sweeping the industry. It was humiliating, it was very public, and for most executives, it would have been a career-ending scandal. Davis didn't fold. In his memoir, he would later write about the years-long cloud those accusations put over his name, noting that when he was eventually cleared of the most serious allegations, that vindication received nowhere near the media attention that the original accusations had. He had lived under a shadow of rumor and guilt by association for years, and it barely made news when the shadow lifted. In 1974, Davis founded Arista Records, and instead of quietly rebuilding, he came back swinging. Arista launched Barry Manilow into stardom, revitalized Aretha Franklin's commercial career, and gave a home to talents like Patti Smith and Dionne Warwick. Later, when Arista expanded into country music, the label struck gold again with Alan Jackson and Brooks and Dunn. Then came the discovery that would define the second half of his career. In the early 1980s, Davis heard a 19-year-old unknown named Whitney Houston. She was singing backup in her mother's cabaret act at a small Manhattan nightclub. He signed her almost immediately. What followed wasn't just a signing, it was a full creative partnership that lasted the rest of Houston's life. Davis helped select her material, shape her sound, and guide the arc of her career. The result was a run of 7 consecutive #1 singles, including Saving All My Love for You, How Will I Know, I Wanna Dance with Somebody Who Loves Me, and Where Do Broken Hearts Go, a record-setting streak that helped make Houston one of the best-selling music artists of all time. Their bond went well beyond business. When Houston died in a Beverly Hills hotel room in February 2012, hours before she was set to appear at Davis's annual pre-Grammy Gala, it was, by every account, one of the most devastating losses of his life. He had seen her just 2 days earlier, and later said she seemed hopeful and optimistic about the future. In his memoir, he reflected that maybe he should have been more skeptical of her recovery, but that his instinct had always been to stay hopeful. Their story was significant enough that it became the basis of the 2022 film I Wanna Dance with Somebody, in which actor Stanley Tucci portrayed Davis, who also served as a producer on the project. Davis kept building well beyond Arista and Houston. In 1989, he co-founded LaFace Records with Antonio L.A. Reid and Kenneth Babyface Edmonds, a label that would go on to launch TLC, Toni Braxton, and Usher. In 1993, he partnered with a young Sean Puffy Combs to help get Bad Boy Records off the ground. And in 2000, after departing Arista, he founded J Records, reportedly naming it after the middle initial he shared with his sons, where he introduced the world to Alicia Keys and helped revive the careers of Luther Vandross and Rod Stewart. Keys's debut album alone sold more than 10 million copies and earned her 5 Grammy Awards. By 2002, Davis was chairman and CEO of the RCA Music Group, overseeing RCA Records, J Records, and Arista Records together. After BMG's later merger with Sony, he became Chief Creative Officer of Sony Music Entertainment, a title he held all the way until his death, more than 2 decades later. This is where the numbers get a little murkier than the headlines suggest, and it's worth being honest about that. According to Celebrity Net Worth, the most frequently cited source for these estimates, Davis's fortune stood at roughly $600 million at the time of his death. Other outlets, reporting in the days following his passing, cited estimates as high as $850 million, though those higher figures don't appear to be backed by any single authoritative source. They seem to circulate largely because they've been repeated across entertainment coverage. There's no public probate filing or official estate valuation available as of this writing, so any number should be treated as an informed estimate rather than a confirmed figure. What isn't in dispute is where that wealth came from. It built up in layers over roughly 6 decades. Davis held some of the most senior positions in the music business almost continuously from the 1960s onward: president of Columbia Records, founder and president of Arista, chairman and CEO of the RCA Music Group, and finally chief creative officer of Sony Music. Decades of salaries and bonuses at that level of seniority add up to real money. Arista wasn't just a job. Davis founded it, ran it for over 25 years, and would have held meaningful ownership stakes tied to the label's success that included some of the best-selling artists of the 1980s and 90s. Davis was a serious, long-time collector, with a collection reportedly featuring works by Pablo Picasso, Andy Warhol, Damien Hirst, Dale Chihuly, and Adolph Gottlieb, among others. That collection alone has been estimated at around $100 million, with pieces displayed both at his Westchester estate and at NYU's Clive Davis Institute. Davis owned at least 5 units in one Manhattan building at 465 Park Avenue, one of which he listed for as much as $7.8 million in 2017. He also owned a sprawling 17-acre compound in Westchester County, New York, purchased in 1991 after his second divorce, complete with an 8,000-square-foot main house, a separate guest house, 2 pools, a tennis court, and a home theater he reportedly packed with up to 80 guests during his famous parties. After 6 decades of shepherding artists whose catalogs are still streamed, sampled, and licensed today, the ongoing royalty income tied to that body of work is significant, and, unlike a salary, it doesn't stop when the person who built it does. Whatever the true final number turns out to be, it's a fortune built the old-fashioned way, through decades of work, reinvestment, and staying at the center of an industry that chews people up fast. For all the boardrooms and Grammy stages, those who knew Clive Davis describe him as someone who genuinely lit up around his family. He was married twice, first to Helen Cohen from 1956 to 1965, then to Janet Adelberg from 1965 to 1985. Both marriages ended in divorce, but together they gave him 4 children who remained central to his life. Fred, a media investment banker; Lauren, an entertainment attorney and arts professor at NYU's Tisch School, the very school that now houses the music program bearing her father's name; Mitchell, an entertainment executive and concert promoter; and Doug, a Grammy-winning record producer who followed most directly in his father's footsteps. Davis had 8 grandchildren and lived to welcome 2 great-grandchildren as well. In his later years, he shared his life with longtime partner Greg Schriefer, an interior designer and real estate agent, splitting time between the Park Avenue apartment and the Westchester estate. In 2013, at age 80, Davis made headlines for a different reason entirely. In his memoir, The Soundtrack of My Life, he publicly came out as bisexual, telling television host Katie Couric that he hoped the disclosure would lead to greater public understanding around bisexuality. It was a striking moment of candor from a man who had spent decades as one of the most recognizable executives in entertainment. When the family announced his death, their statement struck a tone that stood in contrast to the industry tributes flooding in elsewhere. They described him as the person who had been a steady, central presence in their lives, a source of wisdom and encouragement, and said that through every chapter of his career, his family remained his greatest source of pride. It was, by the account of nearly everyone who read it, the kind of statement that stops you mid-scroll. His funeral was held on June 29 at Central Synagogue in New York City, with eulogies delivered by Bruce Springsteen, Barry Manilow, Alicia Keys, and Dionne Warwick, 4 artists whose careers he had shaped across 4 different decades, standing up to say goodbye to the man who found them. What made Clive Davis remarkable wasn't just that he had a hot streak. It's that the streak lasted more than 60 years, across genres that had almost nothing in common with each other. Rock, soul, R&B, pop, and hip-hop adjacent labels like Bad Boy and LaFace. Most executives peak in one era and fade when musical tastes shift. Davis kept adapting over and over, while staying at the very top of an industry famous for discarding people the moment they're no longer useful. He won 5 Grammy Awards across his career, including the Grammy Trustees Award and a Lifetime Achievement Award, and in 2000 he was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a non-performer, one of the rarest honors the institution gives, reserved for people who fundamentally shaped the sound of the era without ever picking up an instrument themselves. He also invested heavily in the next generation of the business. In 2002, he donated $5 million to NYU's Tisch School of the Arts to establish a music industry program, followed by another $5 million gift in 2011. The program was renamed the Clive Davis Institute of Recorded Music in his honor, and it continues training aspiring music executives to this day. And then there was the party. His annual pre-Grammy Gala, which he hosted for decades, became one of the most coveted invitations in entertainment, a room that pulled in music legends, rising stars, and even political figures. At his final gala, in January 2026, guests included Jelly Roll, Brandi Carlile, Lana Del Rey, and Shabuzi, and former President Barack Obama appeared via video tribute, remarking that Davis's real talent had always been noticing what everyone else missed. By the time he passed, Davis had been actively working in the music industry for nearly 70 consecutive years, signing, mentoring, and championing artists well into his 90s. In a business that rarely lets anyone stick around that long, he never really left. Clive Davis's fortune, whatever its final precise number turns out to be, was never really the point. It was simply the byproduct of a career spent doing one thing better than almost anyone else in history: listening. He heard something in Janis Joplin, in Whitney Houston, in Alicia Keys, in Bruce Springsteen, before the rest of the world caught up. And in the process, he didn't just build a fortune. He built the soundtrack that an entire country grew up on. He leaves behind 4 children, 8 grandchildren, 2 great-grandchildren, a partner who loved him, and a catalog of music that will likely outlive all of us. Not bad in the end, for a kid from Crown Heights who once thought he'd spend his whole career writing contracts. If this story resonated with you, let us know in the comments which Clive Davis discovery you think left the biggest mark on music: Whitney Houston, Bruce Springsteen, or Alicia Keys. And if you want more stories like this one, make sure you're subscribed for what's coming next. Sources referenced: NPR, CNN, NBC News, Wikipedia, Celebrity Net Worth, Yahoo Entertainment, Hello Magazine, Soap Central, Parade, and Legacy.com obituary coverage.